Ray Dalio has released another article explaining the rise and fall of empires, including why the US empire will collapse in the next decade. It's scary stuff. And this is part of his massive Changing World Order series. So we're going to go through this article here and break down exactly what he's saying, because he does get a little confusing sometimes, so we're going to simplify it so we all understand what is in America's future. So the article itself is the big cycles of the Dutch and British empires and their currencies. So if you're wondering why do empires collapse in the first place, because things go really well for a while, that is what we're going to cover. So first question is, what does the cycle of an empire actually look like? Well, here's an ultra simplified version of what each empire goes through. Starts with a new world order, which usually happens after a war where all the countries come together in the world and say, okay, you guys suck, you guys are great, you're going to lead the things from now on. Doesn't go exactly like that, obviously, but there are winners and losers, and the new world order is formed. Then you get a long period of peace, prosperity, and productive debt growth. Meaning everything is going great. People are able to borrow money. There's technology that everyone's into instead of warring with each other. Things go really well. The living standards go up. But eventually you hit a debt bubble because people borrowed too much. And you get that big wealth gap too. You got a few rich people and a bunch of poor people. And if you're wondering where America fits on this graph right here, well, I think we're going to be right here in the debt bubble and big wealth gap. But we'll see. Then from there, that's the rise of the empire. You hit this peak and then you hit the downturn. So the debt bubble that got formed from all the borrowing and spending we were doing, it starts to bust. You see that economic downturn from it. Then the government, as you see them doing right now, they print money nonstop to try and keep things going, keep the wheels moving, but it doesn't work too well. Eventually you head into revolutions and wars. Revolutions because people are tired of the wealth gap, and wars because countries start, they start switching power roles. Hint, hint, China. And then eventually you get to the debt and political restructuring that usually happens after the war, such as after World War I and World War II with the Treaty of Versailles. And then you get your new world order, and the cycle begins all again. So again, if you want to know where the US is on this chart, well, we are right here. This blue line is the United States. This red line is China, and this black line is the United Kingdom. And actually we can make this a little more clearer, so we can remove Germany, Russia, Japan, all these other countries. And if we scroll down, we see just the big ones, the recent ones. The United Kingdom, Great Britain, the whole British Empire, they had their peak back in it was after 1850. Then the US took over because you see this blue line crossing this black line. And then we had our peak in 1950. Oh, that sucks. And now you see China, the red line, shooting higher. And remember I said when the countries get too powerful, normally when you see this crossover with these lines, that's when you start to see conflicts. So you can see kind of what's going to happen here between the red line and the blue line. And that's what Dalio says right here. And you can see that they are approaching comparability. He's talking about China and the US, which is when the risks of wars of one type or another are greater than when the leading powers are earlier in the cycle. See, when the US is here and China is here, well, China isn't going to mess with us. Now, what exactly are these lines anyway? What are they made up of? It makes sense with the power and the decline based off the chart that we saw before, this one, but how is this even calculated? Because they just look like lines right now. Well, the way Dalio does it is through 8 measures of strength, and you can see that right here in this chart. You got education, trade, innovation and technology, output, competitiveness, financial centers, military and reserve status. Now this looks like a bunch of lines, but you can see they all kind of go together, but there's a few things you can realize here when you're looking at this. First, which is the first line that goes the highest, the earliest? Well, it's this blue line, right? It kind of sticks out, and that is education. Because according to Dalio, when a country's education, or let's say an empire's education is strong, all these other things kind of fall into place. So here, he says it right here. The quality of education has been the long leading strength of rises and declines in these measures of power between empires. And then the lagging strength is actually the reserve currency. And that's that black line right here, this reserve status. You can see it peaks kind of later and then declines. And again, what does this all have to do with the US? Well, where are we right now? The US dollar is the reserve currency. And what's a reserve currency? Well, it's basically the currency that every other country uses when they're issuing debt. Basically, the dollar underlies everything, right? Everyone compares their currencies to the dollar. That's what makes it the reserve currency. And of course, it gets more complicated than that, but it's pretty simple, right? If you ask anybody what's the most powerful currency in the world, they're going to say the dollar. And that pretty much gives you the hint of what the reserve currency is at the moment. So anyway, as I was saying, education is a leading indicator of an empire and reserve currency status is the lagging indicator. Reason why is strong education education leads to strengths in most areas, including the creation of the world's most common currency. That common currency, just like the world's common language, tends to stay around. That's why it lags, right? Even after the empire declines. And it stays around because of habits. We've used it for a long time. It's tough to switch. So now you kind of have an idea of where the US falls into this, right? We're falling. You've probably heard about our education. It sucks, or you've not. Of course, you've heard about it. You probably had it, but these studies of our education versus other countries, not great. So we've seen that decline, and now the thing that we're holding on to is this reserve currency, and that's big in Dalio's research because that's super important for determining the world power. But what's an example of this, right? Because, okay, it might happen to the US, but how did it happen before? Well, we have two examples. We got the Dutch Empire and we have the British Empire, and those are the two that Dalio focused on the most. But for our case here, we're going to go to the British Empire because it's more related. At least for me, the history that I know, this stuff sounds more familiar, so it's easier to understand. So who ruled first? Well, if we're going back to 1600, it was the Dutch, but we said we're going to skip that part. So eventually there was a war, because what did we say? Wars are usually what change the world order. So there's a French Revolution and the British won. They laid out the Treaty of Paris, and that set the stage for Great Britain's 100-year-long imperial century, during which Great Britain became the unrivaled world power, and the British pound became the world's dominant currency, and the world flourished. And we all know about the British Empire. That was during this time. So we had 100 years of peace and prosperity because no country wanted to challenge the Brits. The world order that was in place was working pretty well. Of course, there was recessions during that time. They were called panics back then, like the Panic of 1825, 1837, and 1873. And there were military conflicts too. The Crimean War is just one example, but the idea is the entire period as a whole was really great. And this is what happens, right? This is what we get during this upswing right here. Peace, prosperity, and productive debt growth. So why did the British do so well? Well, they followed a capitalist system to incentivize people to work, and they financed them with debt. They combined their commercial operations with their military strength to exploit global opportunities. You've probably heard of the British East India Company, which replaced the Dutch East India Company. That company had a military force that was twice the size of the British government's standing military force. It was crazy. So this made a lot of people extremely wealthy and powerful. And during this time, we also saw the Industrial Revolution. So through machine production, everything changed. We had the steam engine finally. So a relatively small country of well-educated people, the UK, became the world's most powerful country by combining inventiveness, capitalism, great ships, and other technologies that allowed them to go global, and a great military to create the British Empire that was dominant for the next 100 years. So that's how they stayed on top. London became the center of finance, and they even had a second industrial revolution. And remember, all of the 8 factors that we talked about before, all these squiggly lines, they all had to do with it. So we're talking about education, new inventions and technologies. They had a higher output of trade, a stronger military, financial centers, all of that. And they had the reserve currency, key. But what did all this prosperity do? It created wealth gaps, as it always does. You got a few people making a ton of money and a ton of people that are poor. And during this time, other countries started to catch up. For example, Alexander Graham Bell had the telephone, Thomas Edison had the light bulb. The United States started to grow into a strong leading world power. And as other countries became more competitive, like the US, the British Empire became more costly and less profitable to maintain. And during the time from 1900 to 1914, as a consequence of the large wealth gaps that were being created, there became greater arguments about how wealth should be divided within countries, and greater conflicts and comparabilities in economic and military powers that existed between European countries. So this eventually led to a war. And do you know what war it led to? World War I. And that was a terrible time between 1914 and 1918. It cost the lives of an estimated 8.5 million soldiers and 13 million civilians. And then they had the Spanish flu after that, which killed an estimated 20 to 50 million people over 2 years. Horrible. The whole 1914 to 20 was a terrible time. And then what happened? Was the British Empire over? Not just yet, because we had the Roaring 20s. And of course, after World War I, the United States was recognized as the leading power, so things were starting to change. And like I said, we had the Roaring 20s, and during that time, New York became the new financial center instead of London. But those other countries, apart from the US, started getting more powerful too, right? They were learning and growing, like Germany and Japan. And when other countries become powerful, there starts to be some conflict brewing, just like we saw before. And on top of that, the Roaring 20s led to debt bubbles that burst in 1929, which led to depressions, which led to the printing of money, which led to the devaluations of currencies, and greater internal and external conflicts over wealth and power in the 30s. So you know what happened next, right? World War II. And now the New World Order was officially created. US was on top. The handoff happened. So now what's happening with the US? How do we become the empire, and where are we headed? Well, the US did really well because we followed a capitalist system too. too. And at that time, the dollar was linked to gold, and most other countries' currencies became tied to the dollar. And that system was followed by over 40 countries. So that's how we became the reserve currency, which, like I said before, is really important. New York flourished as the world's preeminent financial center, and a new big debt and capital markets cycle began. And remember, this is the big upswing now, the good part of the empire building. And that has produced what has thus far been a relatively peaceful and prosperous 75-year period that has brought us to today. So now what? Now we're here. Where are we about to go? Well, the period between 1950 and 70, for it to be so prosperous, there was a lot of debt issued. And I mean, that was essential for financing innovation and developments early on. And when I'm talking about debt, I'm also talking about equity markets, our stock market. But that eventually led to too much debt being required to finance both war and domestic needs. And you probably see the pattern here with every single empire. There is always too much debt. It goes too far. So in 1971, we realized, you know what, we don't have enough gold to support all our dollars, so let's break off of gold. And there we go. We moved off the gold standard into the fiat system. And as is typical in every empire when they move to a fiat system, because they all do, there was a ton of debt creation and money printing that led to a wave in inflation. And that carried on until the 80 to 82 crisis, which was one of the worst economic downturns since the Great Depression. And then what? We had 3 more waves of debt finance speculations, bubbles, and busts. You know the ones: the 2000 dot-com bubble, the 2008 Great Recession housing crisis. Then we had the 2009 to 2019 money and credit expansion that produced the investment bubble that preceded the COVID-19 downturn. So that was our recent drop in the stock market, which I don't think is fully over. So each of these cycles raised debt and non-debt obligations like pensions and healthcare. You know there's a huge pension crisis, right? And if you're wondering where things start to go sour, it's happening right now. Because there are higher levels of debt, which is leading to more and more printing that you see right now with our central bank. And we're all pushing interest rates across the world to unprecedented lows. And also there are bigger and bigger wealth gaps forming and political gaps. Yeah, thank God the election is over so I could stop hearing about it. But those gaps are widening, and we are going to have increasing internal conflict during economic downturns, which are still going to come. And that's where we are now. So who is the country that's on the come up to come clash with us? I think you know the answer. It's China. China really changed after Chairman Mao Zedong died finally, and Deng Xiaoping took over. So they shifted from their stupid Mao policies to capitalistic elements that worked out. And then they had a lot of globalism. They did a lot of things right. So China grew strong in a lot of ways. So Dalio says since he started visiting China in 1984, the education of its population has improved dramatically. The real per capita income is multiplied by 24 and has become the largest country in the world in trade, exceeding the US share of world trade, and a rival technology leader. Yeah, right. Okay. Because they steal all the technology, but is growing at a significantly faster pace than the United States and other developed countries. And we're in a current period of great inventiveness. And you know where this war is going to be fought, this next Cold War, which I don't know if people are talking about yet. I think they are a little bit, but it's going to be in artificial intelligence and data. And in that area, Americans and the Chinese are leading the way. And this is why Dalio kind of sees America really falling as an empire in the next 10 years and China taking over. Now, of course, there are more details in the China versus the US saga, which we will cover. But before we get to that point, you really need to solidify your understanding of debt cycles. And of course, we have Dalio to teach it to us, and we went over his explanation right here in this video. So before you go any further, make sure you click this video right here and watch it. Watch this video about debt cycles so you could really start to understand what's happening between China and the US. I will see you there.